Right, welcome back, and before we proceed with our discussion, let me first welcome our dear guest, Ambassador Mohammed Anis Salim, member of the Egyptian Council for Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good evening, how are you?
Good evening to you, sir. And this particular round of the Munich Security Conference was very much significant, particularly for the Middle East. First, let's give a brief idea about the agenda of the summit.
Well, let me just correct something, because there is a media impression of what the Munich conference is. The Munich conference is the Davos of security and foreign affairs. So it's very much a free-for-all. It's an open forum. It's not an official forum. And the idea is to create a second track where people can discuss things informally. New ideas can be put forward, tested. Groups that are of the formal political process, international diplomacy, have an opportunity to come there. Academic groups, think tanks, prominent individuals, media, and so on. So that is the kind of settings. And so it is a little bit of a very wide take on the current global situation. And so you have people who are concerned about the central balance between and the central relationship between the US and Russia, and the feeling that, as Medvedev was speaking about, the concern that the Cold War is coming back because of various regional confrontations, and the response from Kerry that no, the Cold War is over and we have to learn new skills to deal with new problems. At the same time, European politicians are struggling with a number of issues. They're very concerned about the wave of migrants, 1 million migrants in 1 year. They realize that this is a time bomb for them because of the reaction that's happening inside their societies against these waves of migrants. And the result is that the right-wing parties are gaining more ground with public opinion coming their way. So there is a concern about how to deal with this. Also, partially as a result of this concern, there is a sense of urgency to deal with the Syrian conflict, and a realization about the complexities that are involved in that, and perhaps we'll come back to that in a moment. But there are a number of issues there. One of the issues for NATO is that a lot of the member states are not meeting their obligation in terms of allocating 2% of their budgets for military expenditure. Countries, governments, because of the economic situation, because they don't feel that the threat is imminent anymore, are reducing their defense expenses. That means that NATO is that less capable of meeting the challenges that are now becoming what they call out of theater challenges.
Missions and responsibilities that it is acquired with. Yes, that is a huge agenda.
It is, indeed.
Yes, very much indeed. If we start from the first point you've been speaking about, and Russia and the United States. And Russia and the United States, because we're not speaking about Cold War anymore. We're speaking about war on the ground on the Middle East, or in the Middle East. So yes, we have been seeing much of a trade-off accusation between both sides, the Russian side and the US sides, particularly of the role that is played by each country, and if this country or the other is more controlling or in control more than the other, who is in control more, and on all this issue. Yes, this was a real particular important point that this forum has exposed. How do you view now the US-Russian relations, particularly after what is going on in the Middle East, and how was that tackled during this summit?
Well, the theory or the the kind of idea that was being applied in this was that you can package the different areas of U.S.-Russian relations and separate these packages. President Obama used a very difficult word, compartmentalization, which means that you can put different parts of the relationship, Ukraine, for example, in one basket, and separate that from Syria. And to a certain extent, Washington and Moscow could cooperate in Syria, irrespective of the difficulties they are having in Ukraine. And to some extent, this is working, because the fact that the two Vienna meetings took place and UN resolution 2254 was agreed upon, and this has really brought back the issue to the negotiating table. We've had a gap of a number of years. The fact that the US and Russia have managed to agree on this, the fact that they have brought in a group of countries in the region, that there is a formula on the table that needs to be negotiated. All of these are signs that there is room where the US and Russia are working together. Now, the problem is that there are still areas of differences. Now, in an ideal world, these areas should be ironed out in the negotiations. And that's why negotiations are required. Otherwise, if there were no differences, there wouldn't be a need for that at all. So the fact is that, of course, the conflict on the ground is still going on, and most probably will continue to go on. Now, how do you run these two parallel developments together? A political diplomatic process, and at the same time a conflict on the ground. And it has happened before in many regional conflicts. We have seen negotiations going on, Vietnam for example, while the conflict was continuing. At a certain point, the guns will fall silent, and hopefully the negotiation will come to fruition and we'll have an agreement.
Of course, we all hope for that. Well, the point here, this is, as you said at the very beginning, this is an informal conference or an informal forum where, yes, of course, heads of states, defense ministers, foreign ministers, think tank, and many groups attend, but it's not formal. So your expectations to the negotiations and the trade-off accusations that have been between many parties, for instance, we've seen some of the European countries attacking Russia for Ukraine. We've seen Ukraine attacking Russia for its role of, or what Ukraine called the Russian role in its own crisis. And we have seen trade-off accusation over Syria, very much indeed. Or do you expect that such negotiations and such discussions would be really, or would have a ground in the reality?
Again, we need a clarification here. The Munich conference is an informal, large jamboree of a lot of things. But on the sidelines of that, you had a meeting of the International Support Group for Syria, which is a formal body. So that part is a formal process, and that's the part that generated the idea of the term was chosen deliberately. It's not a ceasefire. It's a cessation of hostilities, which conceptually means that it's something that is temporary. It's part of a negotiating process. It's linked to humanitarian access. It has certain characteristics. So there is a result we have. The test will be whether in the next few this cessation of hostilities take place, because that would create the atmosphere for resuming the Geneva process.
Yes, very much indeed, and Syria is really one of the very important topics that was very much discussed on the sidelines of this conference. And yes, cessation of hostility, and that demands all parties involved in Syria to halt their fire or cease their fires. How do you view this, or the ability of this to be implicated on the ground in Syria?
Well, again, another clarification is that the cessation does not apply to terrorist groups, ISIL, Daesh, and Nusra Front.
Well, so nothing applies to them.
So no, because that's a deliberate. That's one of the paragraphs of the of Resolution 2254. It's also part of the agreement in Munich. So this is where.
No, I need a clarification on this. What do you mean by this was part of this resolution?
It's part of the UN resolution on Syria, and it's in fact is standard procedure in all of the documentation on the Syria process, that the fight against Daesh will continue. That is, the ceasefire doesn't apply to the fight against the Nusra Front, those organizations that are listed as terrorist organizations. Now there are some complications there, because the government and the Russians would like to see a wider list, and in Vienna it was agreed that the Jordanian government would create a list that reflects a consensus on who are all of the terrorist organizations. This has not been arrived to, and as a result, the negotiating team that the opposition has sent to Geneva has organizations which both the government and the Russians deem to be terrorist organizations. So that's another level of complication. Whether it will work or not, the jury is still out, because it is a very complex war. It is no longer a civil war between opposition and government. It has degenerated into 8 or 9 different wars. You have a war between the US and its allies against Daesh, and you have another war between them and the government in Damascus. You have a war between the government in Damascus and its allies and the opposition forces, and another war with Daesh. And it goes on. So if you actually count them, there are 9 different wars going on at the same time. So how do you agree to a ceasefire? What does a ceasefire, or a cessation of hostilities, as we were saying, what does that mean? How will it be enforced? How will it be monitored without an observer force on the ground? There are a lot of problems ahead of us.
One another issue also concerning Syria, before we turn from Syria, because Syria was a main topic that was discussed there, of course, among terrorism, because terrorism also took a high priority there. But yes, do you think that the Munich summit created a kind of platform for discussion, for an instant, for the differences between Saudi Arabia and Iran on tackling the issue of Syria? We have seen lately the announcement by Saudi Arabia that it would send troops to Syria, and we have seen the United Arab Emirates reiterating the same words, but putting the term of US leading such a coalition. So how do you think this conference or forum was a real platform for such discussions, and to see how it would really implement it?
Let me take each question alone. The question on Saudi-Iranian relations. Those are not complicated by Syria alone, the Syrian issue alone. Those are on a range of issues. The recent escalation in the conflict was related to the Saudis executing a Shia leader, and the reaction of Iran to that. Now, I think the international community has been very clear on the need to contain this conflict, not allow it to degenerate into a wider conflict between Sunnis and Shias, but certainly also not allow it to increase the level of tensions in the Gulf. And to some extent, there has been a success in dampening that process. I don't think that a lot of that was discussed in Munich. I don't think it was the right forum for it. It may have been discussed in some of the sideline meetings, but I don't think that it got a lot of attention. The other development is the Saudi declarations and the Emirati declarations about involved in the conflict, and of course that got a lot of traction in the last few days in terms of media. It needs a little bit of a contextual kind of treatment, because when the coalition against Daesh was formed in September 2014 in Jeddah, the idea was that the U.S. would lead and expand this coalition. Eventually the U.S. claimed it to include 65 countries, and lead that war against Daesh. And initially, a number of Arab states contributed to the strikes against Daesh, particularly in Syria. Not in Iraq, because the Iraqi government didn't want to have any Arab forces involved there. They were okay with Western forces, but they didn't want particularly to have the Arab League involved. So that meant you had countries like Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Bahrain, Jordan, Qatar, there may be one or two others, contributing aircraft to the strikes against Daesh inside Syria. As time passed by, these countries dropped out of this process, and soon the U.S. found itself doing most of the flights on its own. So there was an appeal from the U.S. for the Arab world to stand up and be counted, so to speak. And as part of the response to this, some of the, particularly Saudis and the Emiratis, said, yes, we are going to contribute our aircraft, which means they will resume their previous role, which is more symbolic, actually, because 95% of the strikes were American aircraft anyway. So they would resume their role, that was the thing, and then we will be involved in ground forces. Now, ground forces is, the Americans have made it very clear that they will not put boots on the ground in Syria. They do not want to get into a conflict. We know that this is a president that has won an election on the basis of withdrawing their American troops from overseas. He's not about to go and put American troops back into a conflict while he's a lame duck with a few months in the White House. So that's so in a way there's some political maneuvering that's happening here, and it's very deliberate that the Saudis and the Emiratis have asked for the Americans to be responsible for the command of these forces inside Syria, if and when they go in. And we're talking here really about special forces. We're not talking about a massive ground invasion or anything. We're talking about the role of special forces. I think the consensus now is, and American officials have made this very clear, is that we're not about to start a major ground operation inside Syria. We are not ready to take this forward because the possibilities of direct clash between countries like the Saudis and the Iranians, or eventually between the Americans and Russia, is just too big. And if we have a negotiating process, what we have to do is to make that a success rather than going back and making the configuration on the ground more complicated. So I think there's a lot of political maneuvering going on, and there's a little bit of context that's needed to understand and decipher some of these decisions and statements.
So of course, the Syrian aspect is very much complicated, and whether the conflict can be resolved militarily, whether or not the ground troops would be helpful for Syria, and how it would turn matters in Syria too, but today is not exactly that we are focusing on Syria, but let me here have a quick idea about the solutions that were provided by the forum or the conference for the Syrian crisis.
Well, the roadmap for Syria is really in Resolution 2254. The Security Council resolution is very clear about establishing an 18-month transition between starting a political process, a new government, a constitution, and elections. The side meeting on Syria, the international support group, really has tried to help in terms of bringing back this idea of cessation of hostilities, because it was felt that there is an escalation and that would mean that the opposition groups would be reluctant to go back to the negotiating table. But I'm sure that all parties were also leaning on both sides, the government and the opposition, to climb down from their demands, to allow access, humanitarian access. We heard about agreements on airdrops to the 18 or so critical towns and villages that are surrounded. We heard about the idea of the cessation of hostilities. I'm sure there are some details in terms of what kind of measurements will be taken in terms of that. We've heard also a lot of demands from the West that the Russian targeting system be changed, that the Russians are targeting all Syrian opposition groups, not only Daesh, and that the Americans particularly are very keen that the Russians focus on Daesh exclusively rather than the other opposition groups.
We'll have to wait and see what will happen in Syria. Here we come back to the conference, the forum, and of course Minister Samah Shukri, Foreign Minister Samah Shukri, participated in this important meeting, and of course on the sidelines he held several meetings with different groups. Some of those meetings were a kind of boosting bilateral relations and exchanging views of how they see different challenges. Others were about particular topics, particularly of what concerns Syria and Libya. Before we proceed on, because this would be our next segment, before we proceed on, let's first take this report on Samah Shukri's participation in the forum, and we'll come back for discussion. Right. Welcome back, and back to you, Ambassador Anis, and this was the participation of Foreign Minister Samah Shukri in just one of the many meetings he held on the sidelines of this important forum. And yes, Libya. And Libya very much, or rather it took other dimension of importance, particularly for Egypt. And Libya was very much discussed during the Munich summit, and the foreign ministers there called on the Libyan government to reconcile and announce the unity government, which was postponed today, by the way, up to this minute. How do you view this file and how it was discussed, particularly that it is a reason for Egypt, but for Africa and for the European side?
Yes, indeed. Well, we must remind ourselves that there was a special meeting on Rome only a few days before Munich, so probably the substantial discussions took place there. And, Libya is an open issue, so it will be an international meeting. The issues that have made it very critical, as your report rightly said, is the issue of the expansion of Daesh. That there is a concern that there is a shift of Daesh from Syria with the impact of the pressures on Daesh, both in Iraq and in Syria, that there's a shift of fighters and leadership towards Libya, and that the numbers in Libya are growing. So only a few months ago we were talking in terms of 2,000, maybe 3,000. Now people are 2,000. Some figures some estimates are going up to 7,000.
Why? Why the increase suddenly?
Because there is the shift, people coming back from Syria and Iraq, with the additional pressure there, and there is a theory that the Daesh leadership is seeing the opportunity of Libya, particularly the ability or the possibility of getting hold of the oil production and oil processing and exporting facilities in Libya. It also, because Libya borders on so many countries, the knock-on effect can be quite big, that it will give access to a lot of places where affiliates of Daesh are already operational. Boko Haram, for example, have pledged support to Daesh, and a number of them. Mali, we've seen problems in Mali also, and so on.
Shabab in Somalia, yes, there is a kind of expansion to Daesh with different ways.
So the question becomes then how to deal with this. Would it be another international intervention? If so, when, how, who would be the parties who would be involved? What happens after this intervention? We see that the track record of military intervention has not been very good in terms of creating a regime after the intervention. People are very keen to withdraw their forces once the immediate task is done, but then they leave a vacuum behind them. So these are issues that are being discussed. Will there be a Libyan government, a united government that has the international support and legitimacy to invite for an international intervention? Will this government really want an intervention? We've already seen some of the leaders in Libya saying we don't want to have an international intervention. So there are a lot of issues about this. For Egypt, this is very important because already we see some of the impact of the insecurity in Libya spilling over into Egypt, linking with the situation in Sinai. Egypt has a very long border with Libya. It's very difficult to control that border and to seal it. So it is a challenge really to continue with this. We have a lot of Egyptians working in Libya. They are potentially in a hostage situation vis-a-vis not only Daesh but some of the other extremist groups that are there.
Very much indeed. So from your point of view, do you think that the Arabs' different perspective of seeing a solution to Libya really reflects on the situation on Libya, or of how to really treat the chaotic scene in Libya, or find a permanent solution in Libya?
It's one of the complexities in all of the regional conflicts that are alive today in the region. One of the complexity is that the regional forces are in disagreement as to which side they back and the way they see a solution. So you will find that in Libya, both Turkey and Qatar are very much involved in supporting the group that is setting up an alternative government in the West, as opposed to the group in the East, which is usually referred to as the international recognized parliament. So that creates obviously a dynamic that makes it more difficult to reconcile these two parts together. And you'll see that some of this is reflecting also in other conflicts in the region. Even in countries where you don't have an open conflict, you can see, for example, in Lebanon, the problem of the Hezbollah taking a position on the election. So as a result, it's almost a year and a half now or something where Lebanon has been unable to elect a new president. So you can see a lot of the crisis situations in the region where the regional forces are not aligned on the same side, and this creates, of course, an additional layer of conflict.
A third file which is very important for Egypt as well, terrorism. And terrorism featured high on the agenda of discussion during this forum. But the issue here is how do the world community, or rather each state, define terrorism and define who is a terrorist and who could be considered a terrorist group. And we haven't seen up till this particular minute, even in the conference, what really defines what is terrorism, who should be considered as a terrorist group, or rather an opposition, or rather a defensive party or group, or I mean, there's nothing of the sort that define real terrorism. How do you view that?
It's a reality of international life today, that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. But I would say that the distance is reduced now because really all of the big national liberation movements are part of the story of the 1960s and even not even the 70s. You know, this is all history now. And now it's very rare that you have a case where is trying to say there's some form of a liberation movement or something. You know, so basically I think the issue is much more, all right, now we've identified the terrorists, what are we going to do about it? What do we want to do about it? Now, the international system still has huge gaps. For example, if you look at the international financial system, to what extent can you close down the routes for funding of international terrorists? To what extent can you ask states not to play the game of funding terrorists because they see that as some way of furthering their own gains? How can you also work on the ideological side? I think there's a lot of room to address a challenge for Islam, that there is a need for a more enlightened, progressive renaissance in Islamic thinking. And allow the space that is being sequestrated by reactionary, terrorist, violent movements. And I think that space needs to be taken care of. And I think Egypt, Al-Azhar, has a huge role. It's a role that has not been taken up until now. There's a lot of work that's needed, and I'm very concerned that Al-Azhar is not moving on this.
Al-Azhar, yes, very much indeed. Al-Azhar is or should be one of the most important institutions taking part in confronting terrorism, particularly on the ideological and, of course, religious side. But there is also the economic side and other sides. And yes, poverty, for an instant, challenges that are really facing here the African continent, and all these were also discussed during the this forum. But how far do you think that though the participants related or made relevance between all these sides to the main issue of terrorism?
There is a theory that terrorism somehow relates to some what's called root causes, that there are structural issues that create, and perhaps there is some validity to this. But you know, other people are saying, you know, if you look at people who are living in Western advanced societies with good access to education and to health services and to jobs, and then they go and volunteer and they go and they travel to ISIS, and not only they go and volunteer, women who are married already with their own children, they leave their husbands and they go and they travel to join Daesh. So there must be an ideological pull. There must be something, and so it's not enough to say that there are economic reasons for this happening, because the number of people who are participating in terrorism at the end is only a very small fraction of the population of Islamic countries. So we can't say really that it's the economics that immediately lead people to pick up guns and start killing other people.
Right.
And in the end, you'll find that the largest number of people who are being killed are the fellow Muslims, who are also poor and jobless.
Yes, very much indeed. You're quite right. But if we're speaking about economy, then we have to see it as an important challenge to any kind of stability and prosperity of any country. So the economic situation of countries, or the recent situation of economic situation in different countries, that was also a challenge that was really put on the table there. How do you view how the countries or the delegations there discussed this matter?
In Munich, economics is not the big place. Economics is much more Davos kind of agenda. So it's not. It's only in terms of the linkages between the rapid changes, the societal changes that are taking place now, where you have industries are becoming much more technologically advanced, using less and less manpower, and people are talking about what's called the fourth industrial revolution, that factories are using less people, information is becoming much more important, automation systems, internet, all of this is changing our lifestyle very much, and as a result of this, you're seeing new rules of economy and fewer jobs on the market, and people need to adapt to new technology and new culture. And this is creating a lot of dislocation in societies, particularly in high societies that are growing older, like European and US, where the population decrease is dropping down, and they're having problems with manpower and so on. But I mean, I think also we have to be aware of stereotypes here, because when you talked about Africa earlier, the reality is that the African continent the rate of growth there has been one of the highest in the world. And there is a large, growing African middle class. Similarly, by the way, to India and China. The largest middle class in the world now is between China and India, and that is becoming a very important purchasing power, but also very important power in terms of determining the way technology is developing and the way big corporate business is developing their plans for the future. We're in is becoming much more complex, much more interesting, but also much more demanding from politicians. And I'm afraid that to some extent what I see in the Middle East and in the Arab world is that we are debating issues that belong to last century. We're not debating the issues that belong to the future. We're using the terminology, the concepts, the ideas that relate to the last century. And we really need to look to where the world is going. And this is where Munich and Davos and other meetings like this are very interesting, because you see the way the world is talking about the future, and you wonder about that gap in perceptions and in the level of debate which we have, and we really need to catch up there.
How do you think Egypt had catched up during this forum, and do you really think that or did Egypt participate in a way that really affected or reflected or even shown its own vision to how it sees the challenges?
I think it's good that we were there. I don't think that we're still there in strength. I think that I was not happy with our participation in Davos this year. I thought we were under the radar. We should be much more actively involved at a higher level. We should come with a story. We should have our own messages. I don't think our messages are clear enough. I think we need to develop our vision. We're not there yet. I think we need to have a clear vision about what we want to do in the future. We have to focus on our strengths, and we have to get some things going. When we talk about investment, the investment environment needs to be improved. There are clear steps that have to happen. We should get on with that. Our education system needs to be fixed. It's not, the one we have now is not going to take us anywhere. We need to think about fixing the economy. Of course, terrorism is an issue. Internal stability is an issue. These issues need to be dealt with much more seriously. And we have to have a program for transition to democracy. That's the vision that we have to put together.
Yes, indeed. These are all ideas that are being discussed those days, particularly leadership. Yes, it's hard to go ahead with everything at the same time, but...
No, this is the role of politicians. It's not only the leadership. There are political parties have a role, our media has a role, our research centers have a role. It's not the leadership alone, because we cannot abdicate our responsibility. This is something everybody has to be involved in. But it has to do with your question about the performance and our relationship to this one. These are global think tank occasions, and we need to get on to getting more involved and really improve our game.
Very much indeed, very much indeed. How do you view how we participated there anyway?
No, as I said, the formal part, it's good that we're there, but we're not there in strength. We don't have the numbers. Our think tanks are not involved. You don't see new ideas. We're not presenting. So I think we need to review where we are in this debate. There's a whole layer of movement. The global think tanks around the world are becoming a major factor in modern decision making. And we don't have the think tanks, and we're not engaged in the global debate with that level of thinking. So there's a lot of catching up we need to do. If you think about, for example, the way our media covers these events, I don't know how many correspondents were there in Munich. I didn't see any reporting by Egyptian TV stations, whether they're public or private. I didn't see anything from Munich. So I think, by the way, many of the Arab TV stations were covering Munich quite well.
Definitely, definitely. But I guess I'm not the one to
No, I'm not saying that, but these are the issues that relate to the way we relate to the outside world and where we can improve our game.
Very much indeed. Very much indeed. Unfortunately, here. Ambassador Mohammed Anis Salem, member of the Egyptian Council of Foreign Affairs, we thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, many thanks for watching. Tomorrow would be another contentious debate with another colleague. Good night.